There is a particular kind of confusion that arrives without announcement. It does not feel like grief, exactly. It does not feel like illness or crisis or anything dramatic enough to warrant a phone call to a doctor or a conversation at the dinner table. It feels more like standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged slightly. Everything is roughly where it should be, but something is off, and you cannot quite say what. Many men know this feeling. They may not call it anything. They may not mention it to their wives, their adult children, their close friends, if they still have close friends nearby. They may wake up in the morning with a mild, low-grade unease that they mistake for tiredness, or a bad night's sleep, or simply the ordinary weight of another day. They carry it for months, sometimes for years, before they wonder what it actually is. It is the feeling of aging without a map, not the physical part, the slower mornings, the creaking knees, the reading glasses that seem to migrate from room to room on their own. That kind of aging is inconvenient, occasionally alarming, but it is legible. You can name it, you can see a doctor about it. You can make jokes about it at dinner with people who are going through the same thing, and the jokes land because everyone in the room recognizes the territory. What is harder to name is the other thing. The interior shift, the quiet erosion of certainty about who you are and what you are for. Many men spent the first 50 or 60 years of their lives building an identity around doing. Around work, responsibility, provision, usefulness. They were the person who fixed things. The person who earned things. The person who showed up reliably, who solved problems, who handled what needed handling without making a performance of it. That identity was so familiar, so habitual, so woven into the texture of daily life, that it stopped feeling like an identity at all. It felt like the truth about who they were. And it is worth pausing on how complete that identity could be. A man who worked long hours, who came home tired and still found a way to be there for the practical needs of his household, who defined himself by what he provided and protected. That man was not lacking in commitment. His sense of self was not shallow. It was simply almost entirely located in the external world. In what he did, rather than in what he felt or thought or wondered about in the quieter parts of himself. And then, slowly or suddenly, the conditions that sustained that truth began to change. Work ended or diminished. The children left and built their own lives in other cities. The body began asking for more accommodation and giving less in return. The culture, which had once seemed to speak a language they understood, began to feel, at times, like a country they had moved to without planning to. And somewhere in the middle of all that change, a quiet question appeared. One that many men have no practiced way of answering. Who am I now, if I am no longer what I used to do? That question is what this video is about. Not as a self-help exercise. Not as a crisis narrative. Not as a political argument about what masculinity should or should not be. But as an honest, careful examination of why aging hits men in a particular way, and why so many men feel ill-equipped to talk about it, let alone navigate it with any confidence. We are going to look at how masculinity was constructed over the last century, what it asked of men, what it gave them, and what it quietly left out. We are going to look at what happens when the roles that defined a man's sense of self begin to dissolve. We are going to look at the real costs of that dissolution, not only for men themselves, but for the people who love them and live alongside them. And we are going to look at what it might mean to find a different way of being a man in the second half of a life that was, for all its difficulty and complexity, genuinely and honestly lived. This is not about blame. It is not about weakness. It is not a comparison between men's lives and women's lives, as though suffering were a competition anyone could win. It is about something that happens to a great many capable, decent, hardworking men. Men who did what they were asked to do, who carried what needed carrying, who showed up without complaint decade after decade, and who simply were not given the interior vocabulary for the journey they are now on. It is worth saying also that this is not a video about one kind of man. The experience we are exploring is not limited to any particular background, profession, or way of living. It happens to men who spent careers in factories and men who spent them behind desks. To men who were the primary earners in their families and men who shared that role. To men who were emotionally reserved and men who thought of themselves as relatively open. The shape of the difficulty varies. The degree varies. But the underlying structure, the identity built almost entirely on external role, the gap that becomes visible when those roles change, appears across a remarkable range of lives. And it begins, as most honest conversations do, not with answers, but with the willingness to sit with a question that does not resolve quickly or neatly. To understand why aging is so disorienting for many men, it helps to understand what masculinity asked of them in the first place, and why those demands made so much sense at the time they were made. For most of the 20th century, being a man meant something specific. It meant working. It meant being physically capable. It meant not showing excessive emotion. It meant being the person other people depended on, rather than the person who depended on others. It meant solving problems, not discussing your feelings about them at length. It meant being useful in ways that were measurable and concrete. These were not arbitrary demands invented by cruelty or ignorance. They had a genuine historical logic. In an economy built on physical labor, industrial production, and the practical demands of raising families through wars, depressions, and periods of rapid change, these qualities kept households functioning and communities surviving. The strong, quiet, reliable man was not merely a myth invented for films or novels. He was a practical necessity in a world that required exactly those qualities and valued them clearly. Boys absorbed this model early, not through explicit instruction in most cases. Few fathers sat their sons down and delivered a lecture on what it meant to be a man. The lesson arrived through atmosphere and expectation. Through the way a room went quiet when a boy cried too long or too openly. Through the gentle, or not so gentle, redirection when a boy expressed fear or confusion or sadness in a way that made the adults around him uncomfortable. Through watching what the men in their lives did and, equally important, what they did not do. Through understanding, without being told directly, that certain emotions were acceptable and others were not. Anger passed without comment. Determination was admired. Humor was welcome, especially the kind that deflected from anything serious. Pride in work well done was something the men around them clearly felt, even if they did not say so in those terms. But sadness, vulnerability, uncertainty, grief, these were treated as things to move through quickly, or to set aside entirely, in the service of getting on with what needed to be done. And so a generation of boys became men who were genuinely good at getting on with things. At weathering difficulty without public complaint. At showing up reliably for the people who needed them. At solving practical problems with quiet competence. At keeping going when keeping going was what the situation required. These are real qualities, and they deserve respect. They are not nothing. A life of honest work, reliable provision, and steady service to family and community. That is a life that has genuine weight and meaning. The men who lived that way were not making a mistake. They were doing what the world asked of them, and doing it well. But the model left a gap. Where an interior life might have grown, a practiced relationship with one's own emotions, a vocabulary for reflection, an ability to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it through action. Many men had instead a kind of unmapped territory. Not emptiness, exactly, but a region of themselves that had never been much tended to, because the culture they grew up in did not ask for it, did not reward it, and in many subtle ways discouraged it. There is a particular moment that many men describe, though rarely in these terms. It happens sometime after retirement, or after a health scare, or after a marriage changes shape in ways that are hard to articulate. They are sitting somewhere quiet, in a garden, or in the house alone, or in a hospital waiting room, and they notice that they have no particular thought. Not relaxation, not rest, something more like blankness. And behind the blankness, if they stay with it long enough, is something that might be loneliness, or something that might be grief, or something that might simply be the unfamiliar experience of not knowing what they are supposed to be doing. Most men get up and find something to do. That is the trained response. But the feeling does not go away simply because you have left the room where it found you. During the active decades, that gap was barely visible. There was always something to do. A job, a mortgage, children to raise, a house to maintain, parents to check on, a car that needed attention, a neighbor who needed help. The rhythm of obligation filled the days, and the days filled the years, and the gap was covered by the noise of a full life in motion. What the gap covered, roughly, was this. A man whose whole sense of self was built on external role had no clear sense of who he was apart from that role. The worker, the provider, the father, the man who fixes things. These were his answers to the question of identity. They were good answers, genuinely good answers. But they were entirely dependent on external conditions. They required the job to be there, the family to need him, the tasks to keep coming. And tasks, by their nature, do not go on forever in the same form. The children grow up, the job ends, the mortgage is paid, the house is quieter, and what was once a life organized entirely around the needs of others becomes, gradually and sometimes frighteningly, a life in which the question of what you yourself need, what you yourself want, think, feel, becomes unavoidable. Many men are unprepared for that question, not because they are incapable of answering it, but because they were never asked to practice. The statistics on aging in men are worth knowing, even if statistics can only gesture at something that is, ultimately, a deeply personal experience lived one person at a time. Men over the age of 65 have significantly higher suicide rates than women of the same age. In most Western countries, men account for the large majority of suicides in late life, even though depression is more frequently diagnosed in women across all age groups. Men are considerably less likely to seek help for mental health difficulties, from a doctor, a therapist, or even in honest conversation with someone they trust. They are less likely to have close friendships outside of their marriages. And when a spouse dies, widowed men face a markedly sharper decline in health, both physical and mental, than widowed women of the same age. A pattern that suggests men are far more dependent on a single relationship for their social and emotional sustenance than they typically realize until that relationship is gone. None of these figures tell you about any particular man. Statistics are always about patterns, and patterns leave out the person in front of you. But taken together, they point towards something real and under-examined. That aging, for many men, is a lonelier and more destabilizing experience than the culture generally acknowledges or prepares them for. Think of what retirement means for a man who has worked for 40 years in a job that structured his days, provided his community of colleagues, defined his sense of purpose, and answered, every morning, without him having to ask, the question of what he was supposed to be doing and why it mattered. One day, he is that man. He has a title, a function, a place in a system that knows what he knows and values what he can do. People consult him. People depend on him. He is, in the most concrete sense, useful. His days have shape and direction. His identity is secure. And then, on a specific morning that he may have been anticipating for years, he is not. The workplace, which was not merely a place of employment but a social world, a source of daily meaning, a reason to get dressed and leave the house, is simply removed from his life. Sometimes with a party and a handshake. Sometimes with barely a week's notice and a form to fill out. And the days that follow have a great deal of freedom in them, and not always much to fill that freedom with. Women, on average, tend to navigate this transition somewhat more effectively. Not because their lives are easier. The evidence does not support that, and not because women feel the losses of aging less keenly. But because women have more commonly built a social and interior life that existed alongside their professional one, rather than instead of it. They are more likely to have maintained friendships that did not depend entirely on the workplace, friendships that were sustained through the small, regular, emotionally honest conversations that women more often permit themselves. They are more likely to have a language for what they are feeling, and people who expect them to use it. Many men arrive at retirement without that infrastructure. The friendships they had were often anchored in work or in the social world of their children's school years, and those contexts have long since changed or ended. The conversations they were comfortable having were usually about practical things, external things, things that could be fixed or reported. The inner vocabulary was never developed, because the culture they grew up in did not ask for it and in many ways actively discouraged it. And so when retirement arrives, or illness, or the death of a spouse, or the slow accumulation of changes that is simply the ordinary passage of age, many men find themselves facing something for which they have no prepared response. This is where depression often enters, not always through dramatic crisis, but through the back door, through the gradual flattening of days that no longer have a clear shape or purpose, through the loss of structure that work provided automatically and that now requires deliberate construction, through the slow and steady contraction of the social world that happens when the last major shared institution disappears and new connection does not arrive to replace it, through the quiet, persistent feeling of becoming slightly unnecessary, of being, in a way that is difficult to articulate, less present in the world than before. Many men will not recognize this as depression. They will call it getting older. They will say they are fine, and mean it more or less, because they have no real comparison point that tells them what not fine would look like for someone like them. They were raised in a tradition that treated certain kinds of difficulty as simply the weather, something you acknowledge briefly and then move through without making a fuss. And the tradition had its logic. There is something genuinely valuable in the ability to carry on. It is not pretense for its own sake. The capacity to function when things are hard is a real skill, and one that served many men, and the people who depended on them, through genuinely difficult circumstances. The problem is not the capacity. The problem is when it becomes the only response available. When carrying on is all you know how to do, even when what the situation actually requires is stopping, looking, and asking for a different kind of help. Around them, the people who love them will watch. The spouse who sees the days getting quieter and the conversations getting shorter. The adult child who calls and senses something different in the tone but cannot quite name it. The friends, if there are still close ones nearby, who notice that their friend seems less like himself but do not know how to say so without making it strange. There is a particular kind of distance that can settle into a household where an aging man has lost his moorings. Not the distance of conflict or hostility, not coldness, just the distance of things unsaid, accumulated slowly over time until the air in a room carries the weight of them. He is present, physically. He is there at the dinner table, there on the sofa in the evening, there in the bed beside his wife. But something essential has gone quiet, has moved behind glass, and neither he nor the people around him quite knows how to reach it. He was not raised to be reached in that way. He was raised to be relied upon. And so he continues to be relied upon, in the ways that are still available to him. He fixes things. He drives. He takes care of the house and the garden. He shows up for his grandchildren when they visit. He is there, and he is steady, and he would not say anything is wrong if anyone asked. But carrying on and being well are not always the same thing. And the cost of never quite closing that distance is borne, quietly, patiently, often invisibly, by the man himself and by the people who love him. There is a framework from developmental psychology that I find quietly useful when thinking about this particular challenge of aging. It comes from the work of Erik Erikson, a psychologist who spent much of the 20th century exploring how human beings develop, not just in childhood, but across the entire span of a life. Erikson proposed that we face distinct psychological challenges at each stage of life. Not crises in the dramatic sense, but genuine turning points. Moments when the way we have been organizing our inner lives is no longer quite adequate, and something new is called for. The challenge of late adulthood, the years from roughly 60 onward, he called integrity versus despair. The question at the heart of this stage is deceptively simple. Can a person look back at the life they have lived and find in it something coherent, meaningful, and honest? Can they hold the complexity of that life? The choices made well and the choices made poorly, the things achieved and the things lost, the relationships that flourished and the ones that frayed, and find, despite everything, that it added up to something worth having been? Or do they find instead only regret, bitterness, a sense that things went irreparably wrong, that the account does not balance and cannot be made to balance now? Integrity, in Erickson's sense, does not mean a perfect life. It means a life that has been honestly examined and honestly accepted. It means the ability to own your history, without either glorifying it entirely or condemning it entirely. What strikes me about this framework, when you apply it specifically to men, is that integrity in this sense requires precisely the capacities that traditional masculinity did not cultivate or reward. It requires the ability to reflect, to look back at your own choices with honest attention rather than defensiveness. It requires comfort with ambiguity, the tolerance to live with questions that do not have clean answers, rather than demanding that every problem be resolved or set aside. It requires vulnerability, the willingness to admit, at least to yourself, that you were not always right, that you carried fears you never named, that you loved people in ways that were real but also imperfect. It requires the ability to find meaning in the inner life, not only in the external record of what was accomplished. These are not skills that arrive automatically with age, like gray hair or a slower gait. They have to be practiced. They have to be, in some sense, learned. And for many men, they were not practiced, because the culture they grew up in did not value them, did not model them, and in subtle but consistent ways discouraged them. What the culture valued was outcomes. The ability to point to something built, earned, fixed, protected. And there is genuine dignity in that. The man who worked for 40 years, who raised children, who kept his word, who took care of what was his. That man has something real to account for. His life has weight. It is worth pausing here to be careful. The argument is not that men of this generation should have been different. They were shaped by the world they inherited, as every generation is, and they made real contributions with the tools they were given. The argument is simply that the tools were incomplete. Not wrong, incomplete. They covered the first half of life with real adequacy and left the second half under-equipped. But outcomes do not sustain a man when the doing is largely finished. When the projects are complete and the children are grown and the career is behind him and the physical capacity for certain kinds of exertion has quietly diminished, what remains? What is a man when he is no longer primarily defined by what he does? This is the question that the masculine tradition left largely unanswered, not out of malice, but out of a kind of historical tunnel vision. The tradition was designed to equip men for a world of tasks, and it was genuinely good at that. It simply did not look ahead to the years when the tasks would slow or stop, and the silence they left would need to be inhabited rather than filled. The men who age with the most grace, and there are many of them, even if they do not attract much cultural attention, are the ones who found, somewhere along the way, a working relationship with their own interior life. They became curious about themselves. They developed a capacity to sit with their own thoughts without needing to immediately resolve them into action. To be alone without panic. To find something in quietness. Some of them found this through faith, through a tradition that gave structure and language to the inner life, that asked them regularly to examine their conscience, to be honest about their failings, to seek something beyond their own competence. Some found it through a long and honest marriage that slowly, year by year, required them to be known in ways that went beyond the practical. Some found it through illness, through the experience of being physically helpless for a period, which stripped away the identity of the capable man and left something more fundamental underneath. Some found it through grief, which forces attention inward whether you are prepared for it or not. And some found it simply through time, through the slow, patient accumulation of years that finally gave them, for the first time, enough space and enough quiet to sit with themselves honestly. They could not have done it earlier, not because they lacked the capacity but because the conditions were not there. The noise of a full life crowded it out, and when the noise faded, they were surprised to find that what was underneath it was not nothing. It was, in many cases, something quite rich, a whole interior life that had been running quietly in the background all along, waiting for the opportunity to be attended to. However they found it, what these men developed was a capacity that the masculine tradition rarely named as a virtue. The ability to be a person who is known, rather than only a person who is useful. And what this capacity makes possible, in aging, and more broadly, is remarkable. It allows a man to move through loss without being destroyed by it. To find meaning in small things without requiring those things to be grand achievements. To be genuinely present with the people he loves, rather than present in body while elsewhere in mind. To look back at a complicated life with enough honesty and enough mercy to find it, on balance, worth having lived. The tragedy, and it is a genuine tragedy, worth naming as such, is that so many men arrive at the second half of life without having been offered permission, or instruction, or even a clear example, for this kind of inward work. They were handed a long second act without a script for it, trained only for the first. What would it have meant to raise boys differently? To tell them plainly, through word and example, that strength includes the strength to feel, that independence includes the independence to ask for help, that courage includes the courage to look at yourself honestly? These questions are being asked now, slowly and imperfectly, in ways they were not asked a generation ago. They come too late to change the formation of the men who are 65 today. But they are worth asking. And they do not disqualify what the men of that generation built. They simply point toward what might also have been possible, and what still is. There is a quieter version of a man's life that becomes possible in the second half, if he is willing to move toward it. It does not look like the first version. It does not have the same forward momentum, the same clear objectives, the same daily architecture that kept the earlier decades purposeful and legible. It is slower. It is less defined from the outside. It asks different questions, and offers different satisfactions in return. But it is not lesser. Many men, if they are honest with themselves, find that the second half of life offers something the first rarely did: time. Not time as luxury or indulgence, but time as a condition of existence. Time to notice what they actually think and feel, rather than setting those things aside in service of the next obligation. Time to be present with the people they love, genuinely present, not physically present while mentally somewhere else. Time to tend to a friendship, a garden, a grandchild's curiosity, a question that has been waiting for years. The challenge, for men who were built for action, is learning to inhabit that time without immediately converting it into a new project or filling it with scheduled activity. The retirement that consists entirely of part-time work, golf tournaments, and a full calendar is not necessarily a life that has been examined. It may simply be busyness wearing different clothes. And there is nothing wrong with activity, with staying engaged, with finding things to do that are meaningful and pleasurable. The issue is not busyness itself. The issue is when busyness is deployed specifically to avoid the question that the silence keeps raising. The quieter question, the one that tends to matter most, is not what are you doing now, but who are you becoming now. The men who make good use of the second half of life are not those who were most emotionally articulate in their youth. They are the ones who became willing, at some point, to be curious about themselves. Who allowed the question, who am I, now that I am no longer primarily what I used to do? To become interesting rather than threatening. Who treated that question not as a crisis to be resolved quickly, but as an inquiry worth staying with? That shift, from threatened to curious, is not automatic. It requires something that the masculine tradition rarely held up as a virtue: willingness to be uncertain. To sit in a room with a question and not immediately leave for the hardware store. To say to someone you trust, plainly and without embarrassment, that you are not quite sure who you are without the things that used to define you. That conversation might happen with a spouse who has been waiting, patiently and sometimes less patiently, for it to become possible. It might happen with a doctor who asks a question that opens something. It might happen with a friend, a real friend, not an acquaintance you share a sport with, who creates enough safety that honesty becomes possible and something real passes between two people. For some men, it happens in a therapist's office. For others, in a faith community that expects regular honesty about the state of the soul. For some, it happens quietly, alone, in the slow and patient process of writing things down, or walking the same path every morning until one day the thoughts begin to arrange themselves into something that can be named. None of these paths require a man to become someone he is not. They do not require abandoning the qualities that were genuinely good about the way he lived, the reliability, the competence, the capacity to carry difficulty without collapsing under it. Those things are worth keeping. They are not the problem. What they require is an addition, an interior dimension added to a life that was built, for good historical reasons, primarily on the exterior. A vocabulary for the inner landscape. A willingness to be known, by yourself, first, and then perhaps by someone you choose to trust with what you find. The men who find that path do not transform into different people. They become, in some way that is hard to describe quickly, more fully themselves. The things they always sensed but never quite said, the gratitude, the regret, the love they expressed imperfectly but meant completely, the fear they carried alone for years, begin, gradually and unevenly, to find their way toward the surface. And the life that results is not a life without loss or difficulty or the ordinary indignities of age. It is simply a life that has been more honestly inhabited. Perhaps the most important thing to say about men and aging is not about statistics, or psychology, or cultural history. It is something simpler and more personal than that. Many men, many good, ordinary, capable men, are somewhere in the middle of this right now. They feel the quiet disorientation. They carry the unnamed unease. They wake up some mornings uncertain what the day is supposed to mean, or what they are supposed to be now that the old answers no longer quite fit. And many of the people who love those men feel it too, from the outside. The spouse who watches her husband diminish slightly inside his own quietness and does not know how to reach him. The adult child who calls and hears that everything is fine, and knows that everything is fine in the narrow sense that nothing is broken, but senses something else underneath. These people are not imagining it. And their care for the man they love is not intrusion. It is, in many cases, the very thing that makes the second conversation, the honest one, eventually possible. To those men, and to the people who love them, it seems worth saying plainly, what you are feeling is not weakness. It is not the sign of a life gone wrong. It is not a problem that should have been solved before it arrived. It is the feeling of arriving at a threshold you were not quite prepared for, in a life that, for all its complexity and difficulty, was genuinely and honestly yours. The men who find their way through it are not extraordinary. They are not particularly braver or more insightful than others. They are simply the ones who stayed with the question long enough to let it change them. Who allowed the second half of life to be different from the first, not lesser, not a retreat, but a different kind of living altogether. One in which being known matters as much as being useful, and in which the capacity to sit quietly with your own life and find it worth having lived is understood, finally, as the kind of strength it actually is. And the fact that you are still here, still paying attention, still willing to ask what comes next, that is not a small thing. That, in its quiet way, is exactly where the second half begins.